American channel. This video is going to be a sort of summary of how we went from being recognized as American when Europeans first came to the Americas to being called Black people today. So according to the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, an American was defined as a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. As a side note, it seems as if Caucasians can pick and choose what identity they want to be, but when we tell the truth about our identity, we get opposition. For example, Caucasians can be born in Africa and call themselves African, or South African, or African American, and they can be born in America and call themselves American despite having European heritage. But they won't call themselves Asian if they're born in an Asian country. Like if they're born in China, South Korea, Japan, they're not gonna call themselves Japanese. They're gonna, other people are gonna recognize them as, Irish or British or German or whatever, and they're just born in Japan. So maybe legally, I guess on paper, it might say Japanese, but between people in the real world, they're not gonna recognize you as Japanese. But yet they can go to Africa and America, the two continents that seem to be inhabited by people who don't want to, fight back and expose the truth about what they're doing. And so they're pretty much vulnerable to Europeans just coming over there and saying, well, we are what you are. I mean, they can even lie and identify as another gender and will potentially even physically attack you if you tell them the truth. But if you show actual proof that so-called Black people are, first of all, not Black and are actually the real North and South Americans, people don't want to accept that. But that's fine. Reality doesn't need you to accept it, and it doesn't need your validation for it to exist. For example, the original definition of American. Let's take a look at that. The copper color race is found in America by the Europeans. So let's take a look at the color of copper and compare that to the people claiming to be American and Indian today. So clearly these don't match. It doesn't matter how much cognitive dissonance you have. It doesn't matter how much you feel about it or what you learned in school. The colors don't match. Now let's compare with the dark-skinned African that we're taught we come from and the average true American. And by the way, I'm going to start using the word, I'm going to stop using the word Black to refer to us as little as possible because we're simply not Black. It's a purely made up social status. You can see we're not Black. Even the darkest African is not Black. They're very dark brown, and no Caucasian is white. The closest comparison would be an albino, which are rare and have nothing to do with the actual made up definition of white. So anyway, using your eyes and simple logic, which of these two skin tones more closely resembles the copper color? Obviously the one on the right. Okay, so now that we've confirmed the skin tones of the original Americans, let's take a look at some not so common photos of art pieces that were found in various places in South America that you might not, have seen just going up on a Google search. Many of these art pieces have thick noses and lips, but many of them also don't. Why is that? Because unlike the lies we have been told, we did not all originate from super dark-skinned ancestors. We do not and have never looked homogeneous like Europeans tend to look. Now, you may have been told, well, we became lighter skinned because Europeans mixed in with us. The first problem with that is when and where did this happen? Like what part of the Americas did this happen? What time frame? Who were they mixing with? Like from what ethnic group from in Europe? Like were they mixing with? The British, like from where? And how exactly was this done in a mass scale? Supposedly during slavery, which is what people who claim that say, when there was way more of us than them. Because remember, they say reportedly that millions of Africans were brought over here, but millions of Europeans didn't come over here until like mid to late 1800s. So that means there was more of us than them, but most of us are not dark skinned and most of us have not mixed enough to where most bronze or most American people are mulattoes. They're not. And in addition, how could they have been raping all these millions of women and producing mulatto babies during so-called slavery when most of our people were not slaves in the sense that you believe or that you're taught? Most were sharecroppers, living on their own or offering their skills and services to each other and foreigners coming over here to make money. They were getting paid. They were not working for free. That's why I said a slave can buy you their freedom. But we were taught in school that they don't get no money. You just get, the slave master feeds you and houses you and you go out and work. And if you don't work or you don't meet the quota, they'll punish you or kill you or do whatever, right? So how can you buy your freedom if you're not making any, does it say it makes sense? And then so people say, you know, there have been stories where so-called slaves say, I bought my freedom, then I went back and bought my wife. Well, hold on, where are you getting this money from? I thought you're not allowed to have no money, but you just out here walking around and nobody's trying to get you. Nobody, that doesn't sound weird. That doesn't make you guys think about like, hey, that's conflicting with what I learned in history class, but from certain slave diaries, you know, is it slave line? Like you, okay. But anyway, they were not working for free. And the ones, many of them that were slaves, true slaves that we know of, were actually kidnapped as children, especially from the North, and they were brought to the South to work. Because you didn't have to pay children. You just feed them, house them, and indoctrinate them. So a lot of times that's where the Sambos, Coons, and Bootlicks actually come from. They were kidnapped and they were just raised that way. They had no other option to survive. They weren't around anybody else. They were just raised to be that way because they were kidnapped. Continuing on, even this guy Alexander von Wuthenau, who's the author of Unexpected Faces in America, and by the way, I'm gonna put the books and stuff that I reference here in the description for you guys to look at. But even he commented on how Europeans incorrectly believed that Americans or Indians were a homogenic people. And despite that not being true, the lie is still pushed today so that you have to look a certain way to be considered American Indian by those same liars, by the people who used to measure skulls to try and determine if certain races were smarter than others. That pseudoscience that they admitted actually, you know, this doesn't make any sense. Those scientists with their degrees were like, hey, if your skull is shaped a certain way, which means the shape of your skull makes you look a certain way. So if you look a certain way, I can look at you and tell if you're dumb or not. And then they admitted later on, like, well, we were wrong. It's actually pseudoscience. It doesn't make sense. And we just made that shit up because we were racist. Like, okay. But you'll believe them when they say, oh, if you don't have certain slanted eyes and, you know, long, thin fur coming out of your head, then you're not really an American Indian. Despite them, the American Indians that they say, you know, they identified today don't match the original description. But we do. So essentially, you'll be trying to convince liars that they're wrong and all this proof is the truth. This is a futile effort. So this channel is simply for showcasing proof that we're the real Americans, that so-called black people are not black or African or Asiatic, that Asiatic black man thing I've heard. There's too much proof from too many people all over social media, like Dan Calloway, 1000 Goatheads, Karimi Howell, Truth Sets Us Free, Tasha Z, showing documents after photos, after diaries, after books, after professionals admitting this. So we're not making this up. We're not taking this from religious stuff and just, you know, trying to interpret, oh, you know, the symbolism. This is real proof. These are pictures. These are diaries. These are documents. These are government files. There's really nothing to debate and no point of debating because it's irrefutable. You can see whose skin tone best resembles copper. You can see whose phenotypes tend to match closely with these art pieces. I really don't understand how, especially Pan-Africans and a lot of these conscious and pro-FBA people, will agree that Caucasians can and have been extremely violent, hateful, deceitful, destructive, and kleptomaniacs, aka thieves, and will do terrible things to really anybody they don't like, including their own people, but fabricating history suddenly seems out of their depth. Like it's the one thing they won't do, even if it gives them power over someone. I really don't understand it. But back to the topic. So clearly we as a people were identified as Americans, a copper-colored people. But then the Caucasians coming here figured, well, it's illegal to enslave Indians. Because it was at the time, especially in South America and Mexico, where they were first coming over here, it was illegal to enslave the Indians, especially because, you know, we were fighting back a lot and it was just too much going on. So they basically said, hey, it's illegal to enslave the Indians. So I'll just lie and say they're not Indian. I'll just lie to my superiors and just say they're not Indian. I'll just say they're African or Negro. Actually, let's drop the African and just say Negro or Negro. You know, Negro per the Spanish that first came over here. So the ones they did manage to enslave, who were actually prisoners of war, because what do you think the Spanish conquistadors did to the Americans that actually lost battles with them? You think they always killed them all? No, they took them as prisoners, made them slaves, called them Negro, because to the Spanish, this Christian Spanish, the Americans embodied evil, which is what Negro or black represents. It made us grow food for them and essentially forced us to teach them how to survive. Later on in North America, when the English began to come, eventually they did adopt the word Negro or Negro out of convenience, but most commonly they called our people colored. So they dropped the copper colored and just said we're colored. They try to include Asians and everybody else in that, but it really just applied to us because other races identify themselves as their nationality, not a color or the word colored. And think about this. Why would you go to another continent and call people who have a darker skin tone than you colored? Really think about the logic of this. The definition of colored doesn't even make sense when applied to a person, especially when we are eventually called black. Because according to the definition, colored has nothing to do with black. But here we are today being called black. Why do you think the government would classify a group of people as colored? Well, I think it's because of what I mentioned earlier. We were already known as the copper-colored people, so they just dropped the copper and said we're colored people. So the government already knew, and they know, that we were the real Americans, but they had to figure out a way to discourage us from fighting them so much so that they can take our land and provide handouts to the Europeans flooding the continent. So they began to target our identity and began to slowly redirect our attention to some faraway land many of our ancestors had never been to, which is Africa. And if you insisted on being called American or even Indian, especially when they came to, take the census, because you couldn't choose your own race on the census until like late 1900s. And so if you insisted on being called American or Indian and not colored or Negro, Caucasians would do what they do best and come to terrorize you and your family and run you off the land or just kill you. So the relatives and children would see this and learn that they should accept whatever the Caucasian calls them or they might be killed. They'll just kill and say, oh, I'm not Negro, I'm an Indian. All right, cool. Come back later that night, kill your whole family. They do that today for no reason, just because they don't like you. You don't think they're doing that? They wouldn't do that back then to push an agenda. So a lot of Americans still feel this way today, by the way. They don't want to challenge what Caucasians say, especially when it comes to their identity and history, because deep down, I really think we're actually scared that you might lose your life. And that's a topic that a lot of us don't want to address. But I might make a video about that, about Americans that told the truth and were killed for it. And I'm not talking about telling the truth on the internet. I'm talking about if a Caucasian or anybody walked up to you in real life, in person, and asked you if you was are you a black person, you should say, no, I'm an American Indian. What tribe you from? All this shit in its history. No, I don't know what tribe I'm from. Does that change the history? Does that change what actually happened? It's like, well, if you're not part of a tribe, then okay, so if I go with that logic, well, if I'm not part of a tribe, that I'm not American Indian, then you're just falling into the hands and the plans of what the government initially did. The reason why they separated you from your tribes and history, and it's tribe another thing, I think we should just do away with the tribes altogether because that causes division. That's why we went from the Maya and all these other civilizations in South America, and we came to North America, you started breaking apart and becoming all these tribes, and the Europeans were able to come over here and divide and conquer. That's the problem with having tribes. So we really don't need tribes no more. It's a new age. We just don't need that no more. Just leave that in the past. But just because you don't know your tribe, don't mean that all the history and what happened don't make sense. Because these Caucasians come over here, Europe, a lot of them, they really believe they're American for real. They just totally threw out the German, the Italian, the French. They just threw all that out, especially if they've been here for like 300 years. They really believe they're American. They do not acknowledge that they have history someplace else. Their history starts when they came here. But when you show proof of it, it's like, nah, you not that. So just don't argue with those people. Say I'm American, what's your tribe? Just tell them it's none of their business. You don't even have to tell them you don't know, because just tell them none of their business and move on. You don't have to prove anything to them. You just have to know the truth and teach your children. Okay? But, that's a topic a lot of us don't want to address. But again, I'll make a video about that later on. But anyway, they set our sights on Africa. But they didn't want to call us Africans until the 1900s. So if we were actual Africans, why weren't we called that from the very beginning? Yet they called actual Africans Africans. When the few Africans that did come here on boats arrived, they weren't called Negroes. They were called Africans, as in 6 Africans landed ashore with a trader and so. Africans were not called colored or Negro. Keep that in mind.
In 1958, we couldn't eat in the restaurants in Louisville. We couldn't eat downtown. One day I saw 2 Africans go in with their robes and their turbans. They couldn't speak English. I heard the man say, "Let them in, they're not Negroes." I said, "Something's wrong. I can't say it's because I'm black, because they're so black and they're blue," but they went in.
So eventually, Spanish Negro became the English black. And in the beginning, a lot of our elders didn't want to accept that term because it was and still is an insult. So whenever you're called or classified as black, you're being insulted.
To call a person of color, like myself or others, black, was considered derogatory. That's just a fact. You know, you call somebody black, those were fighting words.
And by the definition of the word, it should be considered a racial slur. So because Americans weren't vibing with the black thing at first, they used entertainers like James Brown and other influencers who were on board with pushing being called black, despite knowing what it meant to their elders. And you're being insulted, not only because of the definition of black, but because traditionally putting black on something is meant to hide it, such as its use on classified or hidden documents. The symbolism of black besides evil is to hide something because you cannot see into blackness, which is darkness. You can't see. And if you can't see, you don't know where you're going, you don't know where you came from, you don't know what you are or who you are, you don't know what to do. But you know who does know what to do? White people. The white people, the pure ones, the good ones, the ones that have the light to guide you despite having to having to literally hold their hands in creating this society known as the United States. And you having to invent literally any and everything that actually matters in that progressive society and just hand that over to them. Because most inventions that have progressed society were invented by us. That's for another video too. So when you hear Caucasians say we built this country and all these inventions, they're lying. They're lying. They don't show any proof of anything that they're saying, and they're not going to admit that many of their so-called inventions actually just outright stole inventions from an American. So how can you take them seriously when they say stuff like that? So anyway, they called you black. That essentially erased anything you knew about your real history and it left you wide open for them to replace that with African studies and history, which was first taught by a Jew. You don't think that maybe there's an agenda behind that? They couldn't even try and be more convincing with the lie by getting an American or even an African to come up with those studies. They were just bold about it and put a Jew up there. But let's say this guy truly believed we came from Africa. That means he's kind of dumb because we don't even look like or share culture with Africans. So I don't know how he could have made that connection. That's like saying, well, Chinese people and Korean people look pretty similar, so they're practically the same people. Or the English and the Irish look similar, so they're pretty much the same. Now, if we're being technical, you know that isn't true. You know that have different histories, different cultures, different languages. He also knew that Americans were treated differently than Africans. So you can't tell me you live under a rock. You know these two groups are treated differently in the United States. So the possibility that he didn't know just makes him look stupid for coming to that conclusion. The other possibility is that he knew Americans were not Africans and was commissioned by the government to make these studies. This latter possibility makes more sense and is more in line with what the US government tends to do historically. So African studies was made up by a Jew and passed on to Americans to convince us we're African, despite Africans not liking us, not identifying with us because they know we're not them. But nobody is willing to just say that they're American, just that we are American, just say it. Instead, they want to keep slapping labels on us that don't make any sense and throw a tantrum if we don't accept it. Calling us black makes as much sense as someone claiming to be non-binary. Let's be honest. Your skin is not black, and a person is either male or female. That's the end of it. You were eventually called black, so you can be the yin to the Caucasians' yang, and really the rest of the world yang too. As long as you call yourself black, white is going to be attached to you like a tick, sucking the life out of you and giving you diseases. This is one reason why they claim to hate you, but just can't seem to leave you alone. It's like no matter where you go, they always seem to want to be where you are, even if it's a dangerous hood or the projects. They even let you care for their kids, even breastfed a lot of them in the past, yet they hate you so much. So we've just got to completely disconnect ourselves from black so that white can just wither up and go away. Because if you attach yourself to the label black, African, colored, or whatever false name that they give you, you are going to attract these beasts to you because you are part of their dichotomy. You're part of the whiteness. You are what keeps them going. Black and white go together because they're really the same. One is just a lighter or darker state than the other, but both are blank. Nothing, devoid of life, devoid of beauty, just nothing. White is nothing, black is nothing. You've never looked at something that's pure white or pure black in comparison to something that is very colorful and look at those black and white things and say that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. No, it's just blank. It's meant for something to be put upon it. Otherwise, it's just nothing. So if you realize that you're American, your entire mindset shifts. You're not worrying about Africa or any other place on the planet. Your priority is to take charge of your land, take charge of your culture, and white people are low on the priority list, and that's what they don't want, because again, they are parasites like ticks, and they gotta attach themselves to a host to suck the life out of them to survive. Everywhere they go, they use up the resources including you. They abuse the resources including you, and abandon it or just throw it away when it runs out, including you. If you take necessary precautions, of course, when you're out and about or when you're buying land or just, living day to day, take those necessary precautions when you're around them. But you're not trying to associate with them while you're focused on being American, not a U.S. citizen, by the way, but American and all the reality that comes with that. If you do that, how are they going to survive? They won't. They already won't be here in about 100 years max. They got 100 years max. They've self-admitted that they're not gonna be here. They're not gonna be no Caucasians. They're not having babies fast enough. The Japanese are going out of here. Everybody else on the planet is going out of here, including so-called black people. That's another video too. But they out of here. Ain't no 1,000 years of white supremacy. That doesn't exist. How could you even say that out your mouth? They're dying out. They're about to be gone. So why are you worried about detaching yourself from the people who won't even be here anymore soon? Stop accepting names from a group of people that claim to be so smart and they can't even save themselves. They focusing on Ukraine and all these other things going on, and they're dying. And where are your priorities? You think I'm gonna go to space? I'm gonna go underground bunker? I was like, that's not gonna help you. They can't even save themselves, but you're taking names and labels from them. You're not black. You're American.